Hi everyone. So differences between INFJs and INTJs are very commonly discussed. What's not quite as commonly discussed is the similarities, even though there are actually more similarities than differences, and that makes a lot of sense because the two types are they share a dominant function in common, right? So the introverted who share, and they are sharing a dominant function in common, and therefore by definition an inferior function in common. I mean, that is a recipe for having a lot of similarities. INTJs and INFJs have more in common, for example, than INFJs and ISTPs, even though on paper ISTPs have all their functions in common with INFJs. The main difference being that they don't have the same dominant function in common. Even if some of your other functions are different, and of course INTJs and INFJs are quite different in the sense that they don't have the same judging axis. FIT for INTJ and FETI for INFJ. Your worldview is going to be mostly formed, right, and colored by your dominance. Applies to all types. So very close cousins here, okay? So number one similarity, I think, is that they're both hard to get to know. It's much more obvious in the case of INTJs because INTJs are kind of intimidating. Often they're cold, they don't radiate warmth, they introvert their feelings, and they don't come across like they're trying to reach across to other people at a social event or whatever. You can usually talk to them, it'll be nice enough, but you'll have to make the first step a lot of the time, unless they know something about you that they want to know more about, and they might approach you. But INFJs, they're nicer because they use FE, so they do want to cultivate good, harmonious social connections. But the fact of wanting to maintain harmonious social connections is not the same as them wanting to maintain a lot of deep social connections. And that's sometimes why INFJs, I think, can be accused of superficiality by FI users, is that they know that they only want a certain number of friends and they're not going to open up to a lot of people. But for those others, often they keep them at arm's length with a smile or very smart use of their diplomatic competence. So they don't say it straight away because they still want those relationships. They keep at arm's length to be harmonious. But ultimately, in a way, it's even more deceiving, because the INFJ might give you the impression at first they're approachable. In fact, they are approachable, but they're not necessarily approachable in depth. That's for them to decide, and I don't do it with a lot of people, just like INTJs. Another similarity, the second similarity that I want to discuss, is the fact that they're, in fact, this is also a story of NI dominance and SE inferior. Both types are pretty judgmental of other people. This is hard to admit for INFJs. It's easier to admit usually for INTJs. A lot of INTJs, maybe also like younger INTJs who wear it like a badge of honor, they're excited to say, oh yeah, like we're very judgmental and we think most people are idiots. Now, that's not a very mature approach, but it's true that if you're at a social event and there's a lot of superficiality in the air, if you're having conversation with an INTJ, and that also works for ENTJ, by the way, they're much more likely to say out of the blue, God, like this party's shit and these people are not worth my time. And just say that and move on. INFJs care, remember, about harmonious social relationships. Saying something like this always carries the risk that it might be overheard. If they're pretty sure it's not going to be overheard, for example, if they're talking to an INTJ whom they know is not going to repeat this to the other people at the party, God, the INFJ is perfectly capable of saying the exact same thing to the INTJ, and they would be really understanding each other on that front. NISC, the NISC axis, the tunnel vision that is kind of characteristic of it, is also accompanied by a tunnel vision about who is worth their time and who is not worth their time, which means that there's a certain level of judgment when it comes to those who are not worth their time. This would come in contrast with the innate curiosity about strong NE users, but even strong SE users, because extrovert perception is always going to be a function of being curious about others and taking care of doing the discriminating much later down the line, whereas NI does that almost straight away. Perhaps too quickly for some types anyway. At least that's the opinion of other types. And finally, the last thing that I want to say they have in common, at least of the three that I want to mention today, is the stubbornness. But it's true that it's not the stubbornness, it's not like of someone who just wants to do something and that people try to discourage them from it, and they're like, no, I'm doing it, you know, or at work, people who rarely admit to being wrong or things like that. I don't think that INTJs and INFJs necessarily find it harder than other types to admit to being wrong, but it's more, again, it's a worldview stubbornness. It's like the absence of a strong extroverted perception, SE being inferior and SE already being a little bit less open than NE. If we look at the details, just means that once they have a narrative of what, like, you know, what the world should be like, or what the way that their life makes sense, their worldview types, NI dominant people are worldview types. They tend to, they exhibit a very strong connection between their sense of self-worth and their sense of having figured out a way that things make sense for them in the world. The way that things hang together for them in the world and how they are placed vis-a-vis those things hanging together is very important to their happiness, to their resilience, and to their self-worth. Which means that when they encounter bits of information or people or things that are said that seem to go on counter, would require a significant update on the way they have articulated the worldview, or more flexibility at the margin so that they can make room for those alternative viewpoints. It's hard for them to do that, and they're more likely to dismiss those worldviews because, again, it's always a matter of protecting the integrity of your holistic worldview first of all. Again, if you're talking about strong extroverted perceivers, especially extroverted intuitives, you'll see much more willingness to consider, sometimes embrace, and sometimes later on reject perspectives that are different from theirs. They are strong NE users, and to an extent SE users, they're happier to have, more comfortable having a kind of patchwork of different views that they can operate with. With strong NI users, especially INFJs and INTJs, they have this one holistic mold that everything has to fit into a degree, which means much more stubbornness about what comes in and what is not allowed to come in. Okay, so let me know in the comments what you think, guys. Don't forget about these two books that are on display here. The Infinite Soul, my new book on the INFJ Life in the Modern World, how to be an INFJ leading a purposeful, rich, and meaningful life. This is more of an analysis on the INFJ psyche. And don't forget, you know, it's Ecstatic Soul. It's a best-selling book, many thousand copies sold, great reviews, check it out. And don't forget, like I said, about my Patreon page, where I could really use your support. It's not easy for me to make ends meet necessarily. To run this channel, have a full-time job that doesn't pay very well. So any support from €3 a month is down there. Caroline joined recently. Thank you so much. Hopefully more of you will join. See you tomorrow, guys. Bye-bye.